It's really wonderful to be here with you. The radio show that I co-host with Walid Ali, we tried to get him up here to participate in the panel, and Ramadan unfortunately conspired to foil our little schemes. But he did mention, when I described to him what we were doing, he said, "Man, you're going to be in heaven." And he's absolutely right. This is a rare kind of privilege to share a platform with these people, of all people, and to be able to discuss with you fine folks what it is that we're discussing today. And I think one of the things we are hoping to do today is to disabuse you of the idea that it's only kids, nerds, and moo-moo-wearing social misfits who are interested in graphic novels and comic books. They are deeply serious and wonderfully thought-provoking, soul-enriching things to discover. The other thing you find, of course, is that comic books are embedded in political worlds, in real worlds. And it's as you begin holding those fictional and those real worlds together that you begin seeing all sorts of wonderful things. So before we start our conversation, let me introduce you to our panel. On my opposite side, Naja Later. Naja is Sessional Lecturer at the University of Melbourne and a Sessional Academic at Swinburne University of Technology. Her research focuses on the intersection between pop culture and politics, and she did what I would regard as being one of the coolest PhDs ever on 21st century American horror movies, which, anyway, talk about another topic for another day.
Not now.
She's also the co-founder of the All-Star Women's Comic Book Club. Next to Naja is Jason Bainbridge. Professor Jason Bainbridge is head of the School of Communication at the University of South Australia. His expertise focuses on the convergence of law, popular culture, and media. Thank you, Jason. And next to Jason is Paul Mason. Dr. Paul Mason is lecturer in art direction at Griffith Film School. He's also a comic book illustrator for Frew Publications' Kid Phantom. Paul created the Soldier Legacy, an Australian action-adventure comic. He's also contributed to titles including Dark Detective and The New Adventures of the Human Fly. And then next to me is Ryan Griffen. Ryan, of course, is the creator of the Australian series Cleverman, which, if you haven't seen it, shame on you, it's a masterpiece, which weaves ancient Aboriginal stories in a post-apocalyptic modern world of superheroes. Would you join me in welcoming our panel? There's a great deal for us to talk about today, and precious little time to do it. So let's just begin with where we are. It seems to me that these big budget ensemble films, inhabiting the superhero universe, they seem to be occupying the place that the big budget action flicks did of, say, the 1980s and 1990s. Think Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Every year there was going to be some, kind of cheap popcorn film that raked in big money. Those films have now all died, except for Fast and the Furious, which doesn't even rate a mention, it seems. Wow, okay. And that spot in our annual cinematic offerings now seems to be held by superheroes. Why? Why now? Why these movies? Why comic books?
I think partly it's timing. I mean, the technology is there to actually bring superheroes to life. I think that's the first thing from a logistical point of view, that for the first time, VFX is actually able to make people fly realistically, create Iron Man in a way that wouldn't have been possible even 10 years ago. So I think that's part of it. And we've seen that evolution in what the Marvel films can do over that period of time. And the second one is I just think that the world is in a position where we're looking for larger-than-life justice figures. And that's what superheroes have always done throughout their history, and that's such a pivotal moment. And I think you can almost trace the trajectory of the Marvel films through this period when people have been craving those larger-than-life justice figures.
Well, we can't look to our politicians, so who do you look to for that heroic archetype or that heroic inspiration? So,
but I also think it's to do with the fact that, kids who are reading this, 20, 30, 40 years ago are now in a position to make that content on the bigger scale. They grew up on, the live action, Arnold Schwarzenegger films, and hoping that one day they could see the character that they read as a kid on the big screen, and now they're in a position to do that.
And I think, touching on that sort of generational thing where, fans who grow up with this become creators. We may end up seeing really even more interesting iterations of superheroes in 20 years, like if you see what comic book fans and Marvel fans are doing at the moment, where that's going to go soon is really exciting. And what you were saying about the idea that politicians are no longer figures of justice now. On the other hand, we also have the fact that we have a very tangible example of entertainment and politics completely collapsing. So it's just impossible to say that the two categories are separate anymore, in the Western world. And I'm going to touch as well on the Fast and the Furious and say that...
Can someone kill her mic, please?
Well, no, I mean, and it is one of the most racially diverse major ensemble films that's out at the moment. I think people are only just starting to sort of recognise that from about the 5th, 6th film onwards. But also it's doing a very similar thing where, like Iron Man, the superpowers are the technology. And other machines that they use.
They don't wear costumes. That's essentially it. They
they've
survive
got the
ridiculous
cross
things.
and they've got they definitely have a look each that's very much a part of it. But that sort of ensemble storytelling is exactly what you touched on as being really important now, much more than even a shift we've seen since like Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, very much about one figure, but then you look at Captain America Civil War where there's 12 main characters or something, and then something Jeff Gomez has talked about, I think, the idea that we're now, even though there's this sort of hyper-individualism of superheroes, that also there's an idea of collective and collaborative storytelling that Marvel has done so well across its films.
I mean, just that shot in Avengers, you think of that big shot with the Battle of New York where they do the pan around and all of these characters are fighting at the same time. Phenomenal. I mean, you just couldn't have done that so many years ago.
True. Before we get into ensemble films, because I think it actually raises a whole lot of aesthetic and actually ethical questions as well, let me go back to the issue of nostalgia. Because, of course, over the last 6 or 7 years, we have seen a whole lot of new remakes of popular 1980s franchises, from A-Team through Transformers, G.I. Joe, for God's sake, even Smurfs has gotten some kind of reboot. I mean, to what extent do you think is nostalgia? In other words, the people who knew this stuff when they were younger, now they're kind of growing up and wanting to introduce it to their children. To what extent is nostalgia driving this, or do you think it's a bit of peripheral?
I think it's a huge thing, and it's nothing new to the world of comics, because the Silver Age started from rebooting the Golden Age heroes. That's essentially what they were. Flash, Green Lantern, they were all established in that wartime era. It was just a sense of, like you were saying earlier in regards to the technology that was available, they became science fiction heroes. And that was something that was injected into the development of those characters, and a number of those creators took that sci-fi stint and ran with it, and that's how we got a lot of those characters in the 1960s, thanks to guys like Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko.
I think it's the biggest drive in the whole comic world is nostalgia. It is something that you never really put down. You can enjoy it just as much as an 8-year-old as an 80-year-old. If you followed that journey and those characters, you attach yourself to them, and again, if we look at that sort of pop culture environment, you want to share. It's all word of mouth. It's sharing that story with your friend for the first time, and I think that's what the cinematic world's doing at the moment.
And I think that nostalgia is really, really valuable as well, because it does cause us to reflect on, times like the 80s and Reaganite politics, and particularly, again, to bring up like Captain America, sort of the one of the sort of foremost figures in this exhibition and its promotion. There's a lot of really good reasons to reflect on, 1941 when Captain America launched, and a lot of the kind of conversations that are happening everywhere. And so reflection, as well as sort of a warm nostalgia and a feeling that heroes are really necessary.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Like, in terms of Captain America himself in the 40s and then dying off in the 50s, around the time when Jack Kirby was penciling that issue, that Avengers issue 4, where he was unfrozen again, was when Kennedy was assassinated.
Yes.
And that had a big, profound effect on him. And within a couple of months,
they talk about that in the comics. I mean, the characters will sit there. There's some really good ones where they're talking about Nixon and Captain America. How can I be Captain America when this
through that Watergate saga,
deserves so little of our trust, and that sort of thing. That's very consciously woven in.
I think it's that, and then that's the twin, I suppose, point around comic book superheroes particularly, is it's nostalgia, but it's also incredible agility. That, I mean, these characters were created, in the 30s and 40s, and in Marvel particularly in the 60s, but they're relevant to so many different eras. And it's hard to find media properties that can speak to different eras in that way. I mean, one of the reasons why so many of these 80s remakes fail is because they're locked in the 80s, and they're great. They're fantastic in the 80s, but we don't really want to see Back to the Future transposed to today. It wouldn't work quite as well. So I think that superheroes have that incredible agility matched with nostalgia, that you kind of get that rush of thinking back to the first time you encountered Iron Man, but suddenly Iron Man is as relevant to today's modern concerns around automation, around technology, as it was when it was invented.
Okay, let's stick with the 1930s and 40s for a moment, because this is incredibly interesting to me. One of the things, just historically, politically, we tend to forget is that in that interwar period, there was a tremendous collapse of faith in democratic constitutional procedures and mechanisms as sufficient to be able to hold off this kind of great upsurge, if you like, of transatlantic evil. And one of the appeals then of superhero figures is that they were translegal. They were not bound by any nation. They were not bound by law. And here's where I think Batman will always be the more morally superior of any superhero, but that's, again, another conversation for another day. But I think there was a kind of, we forget the fact that many Western democracies were intrigued by the prospects of fascism as a political form, as what we needed at this time to overcome the challenges that face us. I wonder about this connection between superheroes and law, about their kind of embodiment almost as non-legal or super-legal figures, and almost the embodiment of a kind of fascist impulse within much Western culture.
Yeah, well, it very much speaks that division between justice and law. So if you look at the two peak times of superhero popularity in comic books, if you look at the 40s, and particularly those war years, and you look at the 60s, when Marvel sort of came into its modern existence, it was at a time of great disenchantment. You've touched on that, and you've mentioned Nixon. Those periods of time when law was failing people, when there were limits and restrictions on what people could do, that's when the justice figure sort of takes over as a popular form. And then you get that kind of critique, particularly in the 80s, coming through that, well, hang on, yes, we're celebrating an individualist justice figure who occasionally forms teams, but this is fascist in and of itself, that we really want the Justice League in their satellite hovering over the earth, deciding what happens. We want the Avengers in their tower sort of watching over us. And I think one of the great successes of the Marvel films is they've actually dealt with that head on. I mean, you look at something like Civil War, that's what it's about. It's about that fact of where's the accountability. Sure, it's great that Iron Man can just charge in and bring down, Whiplash or the Mandarin or whatever, but what's happening with that? Let's look at the collateral damage. What does that do to the policeman in the street? What does that do to the functioning of the courts? And I think that's one of the really important pieces of intellectual work the films have done, particularly in quite an interesting way.
I think even the Netflix show, like Daredevil did an episode or even a season where they talked about, inherently the character himself is one part vigilante, one part, lawyer, so that whole dynamics is discussed in the context of that show, particularly when bringing down a character like the Punisher. He takes all that stuff into his own hands, and the exchange that he has with the police officer saying, you need to take this because it needs to be you representing that sense of justice and stopping that situation. So
I think part of the reason why that whole kind of Civil War narrative falls apart in the middle of Civil War and sort of turns out to be a storm in a teacup is because the fundamental agreement that you make in a superhero story is that you can't trust the current legal systems and they are insufficient or untrustworthy or, in their own ways, hyper-violent. And so when they say, well, let's set up a system that holds us accountable, that's exactly how Zemo gets in and is able to infiltrate it because there's already too much bureaucratic sort of drama. And to touch back on that sort of idea of the 40s where there is that sort of lack of faith coming straight out of the Depression and a sort of a really huge cultural shift for the US. And I think the narrative that I really perceive coming out of that and the conversations about interventionism and whether the US should have been involved in World War II, the way that you could shape that now is them debating whether now that they have become a global superpower, do they have a global super responsibility? So something that wasn't really articulated in that context for quite a long time. But yeah, something that really informed heroes like Namor, who was involved in World War II. And this is really important to know as well, that these heroes were fighting Nazis before it was popular to fight Nazis, and Jack
Captain
Kirby was out
America.
in the street fighting Nazis
Before
before the
8 months
US
before
invaded
Pearl
World.
Harbor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at something like the Black Hawks back in the 40s. And I mean, that is the UN before the UN was really thought of in that way. It's amazing how sort of forward-thinking they were, those writers and artists trying to engage in that.
I want to ask you all about what it is that took place between the early 1960s, when, you're right, Marvel in its current form was born. And we forget that it's in that incredible period of 1962 to about 1966 that all those people that we now know and love, they really were discovered. I mean, they were invented. They took on a life that really nobody outside of the DC world of comics could even approximate. But something that seems to me, and we also need to recall the Cold War context within which that happened.
Yep.
What happened between the, say, early, mid-1960s, culturally, historically, politically, to the early 1980s, when, if you think about it, Marvel really was just dabbling in the political shallows. I mean, it was lowest common denominator, it was cheap entertainment, and it then really took the work of someone like Alan Moore, Frank Miller, outside of, well, Frank Miller began in Marvel with Daredevil, and it seems to me the Daredevil revolution was just one of the most important things that ever happened within the world of graphic novels. What happened in that period such that comic books became so culturally, politically conformist?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think it's sort of, I mean, I think partly because it began in the 60s, where you had this kind of destabilisation at every level of power. So it's a really interesting environment in which to work.
And a political longing for order and stability as well.
And I mean, you only have to look at those early issues of Iron Man, and I mean, a number of them are cringeworthy now, because essentially every villain that Iron Man faces is representing either communist,
Russian or Chinese.
Here, it's China here. It's it's really
It's still
really
very
problematic.
different from like Commie Smasher.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
But it's kind of like that. Whereas in the 70s, you kind of ease into this kind of almost, Marvel's been revolutionary, then they're kind of settling back a little. And I mean, of course, you have Kirby move on to moving away from Marvel, and you kind of lose that really artistic impetus too. And I think that Marvel was doing very well. I mean, from memory, they were still a #1 comic company through that period. And I think that's when someone like DC takes the risks, and they think, well, they look at the direct market opening up in America, so people going to comic shops rather than news agencies to buy their comics. And that bigger point that Ryan and Naja have already made, that it's generational, that they start to look at the age of these fans now, particularly in the 80s, and start to realise, hey, we're not just appealing to that mass market of kids anymore, let's create something for them. And that's when you see things like The Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, that they're prestige formats, so they're actually created as books, they're sold in bookstores as well as the direct market, and they're adult content. And that's the massive, massive shift there, that I think it's that old thing, when you're not the market leader, you have to be innovative to compete. And that's where DC saw that. And you've got these generations of artists and writers that have grown up with the comics and think, hey, they're not doing this. I mean, it's very similar to your experience, Ryan. I mean, what isn't out there in superheroes? What can we do that's different? What's the lack? That's what Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons and Grant Morrison are responding to. And I think that's when it gets really interesting, that those generational shifts matched with a sense of nostalgia for the characters and realising, hey, these characters are agile enough to deal with these quite adult issues.
Ryan, what about X-Men? We haven't talked about X-Men yet, but of course X-Men really comes into their own in the mid-80s.
Yeah, and well, I think for you touched on it just earlier, is that the fact that around the 60s, people outside of the comic world were having a voice against their governments, or having a chance to actively protest or find justice in the wrongs in that world. And I think what really works for X-Men is it allows the reader to embody whatever their oppression is on those characters, and that's where you start to pursue something deeper as a reader, and wanting to learn more about how these characters are dealing with it, even though it's in a heightened world. But they're finding something that's relatable and that they can jump off from the get-go about, whether it be gay issues, black, white, references to the Holocaust. It's anything that they really wanted to play, and I think X-Men really explored that really well.
I think Marvel did a lot of that stuff in general in terms of trend setting, you know, like one of the first black characters in comics to have a prominent forefront was Gabe Jones in the Howling Commandos, and then pushed through to Black Panther, and then you had, you know, Stan Lee doing the non-comic code authority issues in the early 70s with the Spider-Man series that talked on drugs, you know. So they were always ahead of the curve in that sense. And I guess similar to what you were saying before, you had a number of young college-educated creators coming on board that were fans of that, you know, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko era come into the 70s and start to talk about their current feelings, and as you were alluding to with the Nixon, their, I guess, disenfranchisement with what was happening in their society. There was a lot of that. It really
is there on the page.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff was being explored, and particularly the counterculture, which all sort of stemmed from that 1960s stuff. You know, you were saying how in the 80s comics came to that point where there was an adult market to help drive it, but this is something that, you know, to give Stan Lee a little bit of credit in that department. I'm not a huge fan in that sense, but, you know, being a Kirby head, he latched onto the idea that college kids were responding to this, so he was going on the college circuit and speaking to that older audience, and it wasn't just a sense of making comics cheap and disposable for children to enjoy. There was that underlying richness to those aspects of the story. Once Kirby had a little bit more time to pencil a book without a communist villain. You know,
I think what you sort of touched on with the comic code and censorship of comics being organised in a very similar way to how cinema was in the 30s in the US is so important to how we understand particularly the 60s and the 70s now as seeming really quite bland or camp or kind of optimistic and positive generally. But partly that was so much dictated by the fact that it was very reactionary. But you can also see, I think, realising that that what Kirby and Joe Simon and a lot of those writers did immediately before what became the Silver Age, they were romance writers.
That's
they
correct.
were writing, you know, just
They
churning
created
out
genre.
thousands of romance books. And I think you can really see when you look back at that Silver Age stuff, a lot of the way that they develop those counter codes of inserting really subversive kind of narratives that end up creating ways of reading the X-Men where they're not just mutants, but they actually represent real oppression and real struggles, is through particularly emotional relationships. That, you know, what everyone knows about the superheroes of the Silver Age and why they were so successful is because they talk about their feelings all the time, actually.
Yeah,
like,
it's very soap opera.
You know,
they're
like fainting on couches, missing their buddies, and you know, there's characters who are married who are both superheroes, and that sort of thing is really, I think that's where they kind of brought that subversion in, was through emotional relationships, and you really see that again coming up in the Civil War film as well, and how what you care about, who you care about, ties directly to what you believe in. And then, and what you sort of see as a reaction to that is that kind of 80s, no, we're going to be tough and mean, kind of thing, and you know, and breaking away from the code in terms of really explicit content. But I think we're sort of still just kind of coming out of that with comic books, of realizing that's no longer against the grain. It's no longer sort of radical or revolutionary, and we're starting to see books like Ms. Marvel that are really embracing the idea of, you know, actually doing what's right and caring about people is cool
and
again.
Fun
Yeah, and being allowed to have fun and have, you know, like lots of pretty colours and that sort of thing is we're seeing that pendulum swing back again.
Which is funny because, I mean, fun is such a core element of the Marvel films, and comics seem to drift away from that so much. But I mean, you know,
straight after the Nolan Batman films to have Iron Man, you're like, it's funny.
That's right.
He's funny.
The jokes are great, you know. I mean, you remember those moments in Civil
Really
War and
happy
others.
films.
It's the back seat of the car when they're trying to cramp into that car and stuff like that. That's what you remember, you know. So that sense of fun, I think, is really important.
Yeah,
really
being
important.
allowed to care and have fun and that sort of thing. You know, the idea that superheroes don't care, that's fundamentally why they get up in the evening, is because they care.
But this kind of moves us on to a next stage, I think, in our conversation. And it is worth pointing out, incidentally. I mean, one of the great things behind the way that Frank Miller reimagined Daredevil and the way that Frank Miller then went on to reimagine The Dark Knight Batman was that both characters became the possession, if you like, of a law that was deeper than them, of a law that transcended them. It wasn't that they were non-legal, it's that they were hyper-legal. They embodied, if you like, an absolute principle of legality, of legalism, not just a vague concept of justice. And I should say that I think that's been one of the things that has stood out in many of DC's offerings, that yes, it's far more serious, but maybe we're in a time in which that kind of seriousness is in fact appropriate instead of the very kind of lighthearted entertainment base. So I want to ask you all about this trend towards ensembles. Because you're right, we've now, I mean, X-Men was kind of the first batch of films to really do that, and we've now gone from being the isolated superhero films to these huge casts. Good? Bad? What's being lost in that process?
I guess when you look at the history of comics, I mean, the whole reason why the Marvel Universe exploded was because they, the story of, obviously, Martin Goodman that ran Marvel Comics back in the day, saw that DC were getting good sales with Justice League. So the whole idea of creating a universe in a book is about generating an audience and generating a bigger market, because it's your favourite character and your favourite character and your one all in the same package. So I feel like a lot of these ensemble casts come together because you can cover, or try to cover at the very least, a broad sense of all walks of life in that generation of audience. But what I feel like you lose is that you're not necessarily getting a lot of in-depth knowledge of a particular character unless they've had some sort of lead in that particular film, or a number of sequels or incarnations before they're put into that ensemble.
I think you gain that again, though, through those characters personifying, or sort of, establishing themselves through their relationships to others. Not just necessarily conversations, but also choreography. You learn so much about these characters through the way that they move and the way that their stunt actors move. And that sort of thing is really helping to bring that back. I mean, you do lose a lot. What I really feel like's been lost in sort of blowing open who shows up in a superhero movie and who gets time in a superhero movie is mostly, sad young white guys. If you think about how many Spider-Mans we've had until we get sick of them, and now we're looking at movies like Wonder Woman and then and Black Panther and
it took 75
Captain
years.
Marvel. It's been so long coming, and I think what the ensembles are proving is that you don't need to have this focus on this, one, character over and over again. We would have got so sick of that if we were still just, retreading that ground. And X-Men really proved that.
I think ensemble casts are, first and foremost, these are coming out of, they're a business. So, this is a model that works where, if I use like James Cameron as a filmmaker, if you look at a lot of his work, let's say Avatar, you could see that as a love story, you can see that as a sci-fi, you can see that as an action, you can see, you can go there just for the entertainment of it being 3D. And these ensembles use that same sort of model in a way that they're allowing everyone to attach whatever they want from that. And I think for me that's quite exciting, because that's just starting the conversation and allowing us to then go on these secular characters on their own story, just like you would do in a comic book store. You'd walk in there and you can grab the issue that brought everyone together, or you could go in and just grab the one that you wanted to be a part of. And I think it's quite exciting that we get to have these big pieces that keep the studio wanting to continue making content, because I personally don't want to see any superhero movie flop, because I want to see more of it. Like, doesn't matter how big it is. I want to see, at least if it gets panned by the fans, I want to at least see it do well, because then we have an opportunity to see someone else come and do something different.
I think one of the problems, though, with the ensemble films is that the heroes themselves are being reduced to caricatures. I mean, Captain America becomes the clean guy. And in fact, Captain America is a far more complex character in the comics than he ever has been portrayed. And I think Marvel's Captain America films have been the best, arguably the best films that have been done. But you do get the kind of reduction to caricature. And I think, for instance, what they've done to Thor is almost, I'm sorry, but it's almost unconscionable. So is that kind of flattening out of the characters, is that worth the gains that are made by these big ensemble set pieces?
I think it does really depend on the writer. I mean, there's some characters who, have writers bring out the best in them. So that's why, like, the Russos even themselves are an ensemble team. And I think they get figuring out a team dynamic through that. But, for a character like Ant-Man, he is so good in Civil War because he's in it for 7 minutes. And he lives up every one of those 7 minutes. But the Ant-Man film, I
even Jack
don't feel good about.
Even Jack Kirby didn't like Ant-Man. He was like, Stan, can I stop drawing this guy?
But I mean, even everyone else around Ant-Man knows that Ant-Man's not a very good character. He's kind of the...
It's like, what do you do? Put him next to a matchbox.
He's that guy. And he is. You can read it from the very first picture.
Can you imagine Thor
and it's
falling
good
through
because
the
it helps
bathtub?
the others kind of integrate really well. But, that's something that Whedon talked about, that, he sort of wanted to play Captain America as kind of the straight, character, and that's why he falls so flat, is because he has a writer that just doesn't understand him, and also wants someone to sort of be the butt of the joke. And Thor kind of has that as well, with this sort of big dopey brooding thing. Yeah. But Thor in his own films does a fantastic job. Is a really, really interesting character. And then, and I think part of having a huge collection of directors and writers means that, some get how to make these characters work, but inevitably, everyone's going to have someone else that they identify with, so someone's going to luck out.
It is a very soap opera-ish in that sense. I keep thinking the next big Marvel villain will be Stefano or something.
But I think I think we're really just at the start of it. And for me, I know people are getting annoyed with the fact that there's a superhero film coming out each year. But I think we're just starting to break through, learning how to make these films right, and the more that we progress and the more that we make these films, we're going to know that the technology is going to advance our understanding of our audience attaching themselves to these characters. I think we're starting to get to the point where, using Batman as an example, is we don't need to see his origin story anymore in the film. If you start the film and we're going back there again, we're repeating what our audience already knows.
You can move away from the
formula. We can move away back and just go on this journey.
I absolutely agree that I think it's getting really exciting, and particularly, to reflect back on that, the Frank Miller, Alan Moore generation are, making a lot of the films and some of the comics now. The generation that we've got now, and particularly going into much more sort of diverse superhero movies that are just starting to come out, when they start, getting the funding and the opportunities to make superhero films and superhero television as well, that's when it's going to get really cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Villains. We've talked a lot about heroes, but if there's one thing I think that DC has always had it way over Marvel, it's been in the production of villains. With DC's villains, you have mythical, archetypal characters that are almost the embodiments of transcendental evil. Within Marvel, a bad guy has an accident with chemicals, discovers a piece of technology, and bam, you've got the Green Goblin. I mean, it seems to me that Marvel can never quite make that next step, especially in its cinematic expressions, until it gets its villains right. Am I underselling this, or do you think there's been sort of more complexity and subtlety than...
No, well, like Civil War, they had two groups of heroes fighting each other, and that was interesting because the characters had a complexity to them.
You actually care how that
you actually cared. Whereas I felt like a lot of the other villains, whether it's Ronan the Accuser or I don't know, Paste Pot Pete, but they essentially are just that one-dimensional note. And it was like what we were speaking about earlier in regards to the Netflix Marvel series. Like Kingpin for me was, with a close Purple Man, had complexities to the villains there that made them more powerful than, I don't care about the Red Skull. I'm not afraid of him, but I'm afraid of Kingpin. You know what I mean?
What you're afraid of maybe then, and I think this is what Marvel does do really well, is that they do have faceless villains, because that's often what we deal with in the real world. And if we're not, then they're characters who look like Robert Redford, right? And I think Marvel is much more interested in villainy as not as an individual that can be cut down and fought against and put away in Arkham, but as a system that you have to continuously fight against, continuously, dig up at the roots.
So Hydra is the archetype, if you like.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's why Marvel's having
all sorts of fun at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see that it really in the Marvel films, the villains obviously get a lot less screen time, number one. And they've completely inverted what we'd seen previously with all the DC films, where the biggest names were always the villains. I mean, it was Jack Nicholson's the Joker and Heath Ledger's the Joker, and they're the big names in those films. Whereas you've got villains who have comparatively little screen time. Sometimes they get a bit of an origin story, sometimes not. The enemy's the state. Constantly in these films. I mean, the fact that Winter Soldier, Robert Redford doesn't pull off his face at the end. He's not the Red Skull, it's Robert Redford. He's a bureaucrat. That's the bad guy all along. And that's interesting. But I think, it's driven by two things. One is that's where you see the problem with Marvel licensing, is because Doctor Doom is over with Fox, because a lot of the Spider-Man villains were off limits early on, there's a comparatively small pool of villains. That's the first issue. Yeah. And the second one is you've got to remember the amazing job Marvel has done, where kids now at Halloween dress up as Iron Man or Batman. Iron Man wasn't even on the radar, for kids.
True.
One of the biggest problems they said that Iron Man was going to have is that he doesn't have good bad guys.
Exactly. And it's, that's what the Marvel films have done. They've had to build these superheroes because we know Superman, we know Batman, to an extent we know Wonder Woman even without a film for 75 years. But we didn't know Iron Man. The fact Ant-Man actually headlined a film that did well is phenomenal. It's Ant-Man, for God's sake. He can't even carry a comic book series. And yet somehow he becomes a blockbuster film. And I think that's part of it. That's why the villains, they're there, but they're not as important because we need to build our brands around the superheroes. It's a problem. It's a big problem, but that's where it sits.
Yeah, essentially, it seems like it's plot first, so it's about these Infinity Gems.
Yes.
So they retrofit certain aspects into holding over the entire big story arc that they're eventually leading to. So it makes it a bit difficult there.
And that's why you just love them to get the rights, the Fantastic Four back from Fox. Not for the Fantastic Four, for Doctor Doom. Because that's the closest they've got to their Lex Luthor or their Joker is Doctor Doom, and they haven't got him.
I've got two more issues in mind that I really, really want to broach. And I'm going to sort of solve a little tension to myself and sort of do the second one first. We've mentioned in passing the Netflix series. It is series in the plural. Daredevil, I thought, was a masterpiece. And it was a masterpiece precisely at the points that it adhered most closely to Frank Miller's vision for Daredevil, if you like, as Hell's Kitchen's Batman, if I can kind of put it that way. But Ryan, I really wanted to, for all sorts of obvious reasons, I really want to ask you about this. Civil War was one of my favorite Marvel sequences, and I thought that the film butchered it. Because I love the comic so much. You can't help but bastardize, you can't help but kind of betray the comic book form as soon as you translate things into film. You've had the luxury now of, now coming up to its second season, of doing long form superhero storytelling. Now that we're in a kind of golden age, if you like, of television storytelling, is this going to be the better expression of superheroes and sort of genuinely good storytelling? Or is it still going to be film as the primary thing and then television series as kind of spinning off that?
I think they're two different things. I think you go to the cinema and you go for an experience, and you're going there to see something on a huge scale and come out smiling and enjoying it at the end of it. When you go into a TV series, you get to feel a lot more. You get to learn about the characters, you get to go on a longer journey, you get to see their ups and downs that are a lot longer than an hour and 15 minutes. So I think for me personally, I am really excited to see more comics make their way onto the small screen and see how far we can push these stories and take them on a journey. Like when I first heard about Luke Cage getting its TV series, I thought this is going to be amazing. I was slightly disappointed that we missed more of his origin, but I think being able to be in that world that we hadn't seen on the big screen at all is really exciting.
But television series actually allow you to locate the heroes in particular places in a way that movies simply cannot.
Yeah, I think you get to explore everything because you have the time to explore it. If we look at a lot of the models from the States, you've got 12 hours of being able to explore your character compared to 1 hour, 2 hours, and that's really exciting. So for me, if we looked at the first season of Cleverman, we talked about the first season being purely that 2 to 5 minute montage sequence in any superhero movie where they're finding out their powers for the first time. We wanted to explore that in 6 hours compared to, 2 minutes. And I think that's what's exciting. And then once we've explored that, we can then go on a personal journey with our character from then on.
I think, that having that time, particularly to explore characters that you can't do in short brushstrokes because, they haven't appeared on big screens much, so we don't recognise them as easily. But the fact that you can do shows like Cleverman and Luke Cage and Jessica Jones, completely broke the mould of anything you could have before. And even while they're sort of setting the scene for that to move into the big screen, a much more sort of risk-averse medium, the fact that the kinds of things that Marvel's been able to do on television, with main characters who get 13, 26 hours dedicated to them, who are characters with disabilities, or women experiencing extreme trauma, or sort of touching on like the Black Lives Matter movement via Luke Cage. And because those are happening in Netflix, where there's even smaller a kind of a pool of risk, has allowed people to go, oh wait, no, people care about these stories. These are really, really good, and they are so well executed that I almost don't know if you could do them as films or if you'd want to. But there's clearly what they've transferred over to that in making something like Black Panther is that there is interest. And that people care about these stories, and that people can jump onto them in that sort of shorter format of a film.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick up Black Panther in just a moment because that's an interesting case study. I'm going to resist for just a moment. But there are those awful bits in the Spider-Man films that they're always going to come when Spider-Man is hanging by a web, and he's just about to get skewered by whatever villain, and New York comes to his rescue. What the television series are doing, which I found so impressive, is that they really are making these heroes instantiations or embodiments of their cities, or of a complete political experience, or of an entire community. And I think there's something about that that's then running counter the fascist overtones of some of the past superhero films that I think it's really important. It's a more interesting counterpoint to bureaucratic corruption or to kind of, global evil or whatever.
It's a great idea that the DC didn't do, where Marvel has said this is all the one universe. So, a TV series fit into the films. And I think with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. it was kind of like, oh, okay, this is what they meant. Then along come the Netflix series, and that's exactly it. It's the antidote. That this is really the rise up from the streets. This is people that actually represent their areas. This is, complexity in terms of long-form storytelling. This is villains that actually have backgrounds and depths that we can't do on the film. And I mean, the exciting point would be when those two worlds meet. And I think that will happen at some point if they can resolve the internal politics. But I think that's the really exciting element, that we can do this on the big screen, we can do this on the small screen. And maybe Black Panther is that point where they meet. But I think that's a really, really exciting idea of universe building. Because in a way, TV lends itself so well to the comic form because it's serial. And they've kind of replicated that with the Marvel movies, beginning with the teasers, that, this is going to happen next, and we're talking about an Avengers initiative. Now that they're actually on TV in that form as well, it just takes advantage of all of those complexities that being a Netflix series can do. And it's fantastic. I mean, you've got this universe which can speak to all of these different audiences at once.
And television did always kind of take that from comic books to some degree, that episodic serial storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they have that in common,
Black Panther is one of the next big films coming up, which is incredibly exciting to me because historically it seems to me Marvel has not done race well at all. They've either been subordinate characters or they've been, a kind of very, very, very minor sidekicks. Black Panther is one of the one of the reasons I love him is that he is Marvel's equivalent to Batman. So already there's something in there that's kind of good. It's not Iron Man, it's actually Black Panther. Iron Man is a suited up gigolo. Anyway, Black Panther is so much more interesting on so many other levels. But we've got two interesting things going on here. You've got the fact that Black Panther is getting a film after Civil War. But then you've also got one of the most interesting writers of race in the world at the moment, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's just finished sort of 3 runs of the Black Panther comic book series. And then he launched out into Black Panther and The Crew. I don't know how many of you remember The Crew, but The Crew is one of the most interesting kind of ensembles.
It's got an Aboriginal Avenger.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. But now, after 2 issues, Black Panther and the crew have been canned. As Marvel has begun to diversify, Miles Morales is the new Spider-Man, Kamala Khan as the new Miss Marvel. We've seen sales begin to dip. What's going on here? Is it simply that Marvel represents, if you like, the aesthetic equivalent of political populism? A longing after a more simplified, good and evil, white-black universe, and that as soon as we try to introduce the world as it really is in all of its diversity, the audience is going to start falling away, or is there more promise here that I'm seeing?
I think it's partly audience. I mean, I think with the films, people are coming to these characters. I mean, obviously, you've got 2 sets of audience members. You've got the comic book fans who are coming and saying, oh, wow, it's so great to see Black Panther on screen. Then you've got people whose first exposure to Black Panther is Civil War. What a great character. They're not bringing that baggage. The problem with the comic market is that it's an ageing audience. And by and large, a very conservative audience. I mean, when you see DC's sales go up and Marvel's go down, DC has gone back to that conservative kind of mindset with their rebirth, which is essentially just doing, comics. They're good comics, but I mean, they're your staple sort of comics. Yeah. Whereas Marvel is actually trying a few different things and they're not taking. And I think partly because so many new viewers are coming to the films than comic book readers, and we've seen that the other way, that the success of the films hasn't translated over to comics. I mean, the Black Panther fans of the films haven't come to comic books in that way. They are really 2 discrete audiences. So I think that you can be a bit more adventurous, ironically, in the Netflix series and in the Marvel films than what you can sometimes be in the comic book world.
But I don't think that should hinder these comics being pulled.
No.
I think, we have an opportunity to, like you're saying, like the crew, for example, we have an opportunity to have an all-black group of characters saving the world, which...
Not just fighting on the streets of Harlem.
No.
But really saving the world. Yeah.
And I think, we're giving them 2 issues and then pulling the plug, where we're putting stock in characters that have so many years behind them. Like, let's get more and more in depth with these characters. Let's explore these worlds. Let's explore what they can do for the world before we pull them after 2 issues. And I think, if we can just keep pushing that as much as we can, and, if you get a chance to go out and hunt down an issue, that's the best way to do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's so many problems tied into this because it's partly the idea that representation's only valuable if it's profitable. And there's also the fact that Marvel doesn't often count digital sales, which is how a lot of women and anyone who doesn't feel welcome in the sort of comics bookstore culture, which is a lot.
Hands up who doesn't feel welcome in a comic book store.
and which is why I started a women's comic club. And it also doesn't count the sales of trades, which are the collected versions of comics, which is often how new readers are much more comfortable coming in.
That's right.
And like Ms. Marvel phenomenally outstrips a lot of other books in those kinds of sales. And even like Raina Telgemeier, who does often sort of young adult sort of slice of life or biographical comics, she's the biggest seller of graphic novels in the US. Like a third of the New York Times bestsellers of collections are Raina Telgemeier. And so it's not necessarily a problem with comics. It's not even necessarily a problem with superheroes, but it's that Marvel are looking at really short-term sales. They're looking at a distribution system where the store buys the books, not people buying the books. And then
it's a really archaic system.
This is a short-term failure, and pulling the plug. They're also not really looking at how well the books are written necessarily, which isn't to say that any of the books we've talked about, they're fantastic books, and because there's so many structural changes that would need to take place that would cost a lot in terms of distribution, in terms of store culture, in terms of workplace culture, and which kind of writers, like comparing Chelsea Cain and Nick Spencer, for instance, and how they're supported and endorsed by Marvel is a completely different sort of system to how long writers feel welcome and how long other creators feel like they get a chance to explore stories that may be unfamiliar and therefore not immediately profitable in the sales system that Marvel's counting.
I wonder if it's just, not to point names, but the dude at the top, very much in the Trump administration, very much a penny pinching culture that he fosters. I've had friends who are writers that have gone to the offices and you have 3 editors to an office, you know.
It's incredibly, it becomes insular and homogenous, and those are really dramatic shifts that I think all the sort of buyers and commentators and, you know, fans at the moment are way ahead of the ball, and there's just such a gap, you know, that even the baby steps Marvel Comics is taking to catch up, you know, even just to the films and to Netflix and that sort of thing. We see such a huge gap that we just
I don't get why they
can't
don't have, you know, you go to a cinema and you get a popcorn box with a film. Why not have, you know, some sort of comic promotion to tie something
Marvel's
in?
promotion system at the moment is definitely not something that you want to see a
or
whole
even
lot,
or even the
in your comic
backlogs
shop.
or even anything like that. You know, it's just there's no forward thinking in that sense, and there's
not at all,
why not join the parts together? I don't know if it's the Disney system that came in and made sweeping changes. You know, I felt like those earlier films like Iron Man 2 starting to touch on the demon in the bottle sort of storylines and things, and all of a sudden Disney are on board and it's all washed away, and, you know, Tony's a bit of a party guy and now he's a serious industrialist sort of wanting to protect the world, futurist in that sense. Changes the characters, changes the stories. I don't know.
They still can't decide what they want to do with Iron Man, I think, like, given that he's, you know, Spider-Man's kind of his sidekick coming up.
Yeah.
I want to ask you all, I've got sort of 2 last questions. I've been very impressed at the way that, especially through X-Men, the way that Marvel has handled aging. I thought the most recent Logan film, given the fact that Old Man Logan is one of my favorite sort of series ever, I thought that was done extraordinarily well. And the way that they've handled age, frailty, brokenness, and then finally death is incredible. Did any of you have anything? We've kind of done all the sort of the Avengers, if you like, side of things. I just wanted to add a little bit about, you know, what's going on with Logan at the moment.
For me, I think Logan's one of the best ones that have come out for me, because I really get attached to that real personal side of a superhero. For me, that's what I really like about this. One of my favorite superheroes is Batman, because I like the story once he's off the streets and what he's dealing with, healing him, you know, especially when he gets older, and healing his old body, and dealing with, you know, depression and alcoholism. You know, these are things that excite me about the character. Where, you know, having a film go, you know what, I don't want to make a film for $100 million and make it as pop as I possibly can. Let's drop it down to 30 and make a story that I want to tell. And I think that's what's really exciting. I think if we can start to see more of those come out, the whole idea of what a superhero film is will completely change.
It'd be great to see them age. I mean, I know that we haven't really had it yet because no one has officially stepped down yet. But it'd be great to see Robert Downey Jr. just age, or Chris Evans age, rather than James Bond kind of, here's the new Captain America, here's the new Iron Man, and sort of bring in, I mean, you kind of got that in the new Spider-Man film, as you say. It's kind of like his sidekick, so it's almost like that mentor role.
You get a little with Nick Fury, I think.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
I felt like you felt his age
in that yes.
And I kind of dig that.
Which actually made it. I mean, for me, Nick Fury in Captain America 2 was a revelation. I mean, that was extraordinary, precisely because you're wrestling with frailty in a way that I think the Marvel films have traditionally not done.
I love that, and I mean, I was even talking with my partner last night. I'd love to see a 1960s Nick Fury, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. dealing with, you know, Peggy Carter and Howard Stark. You know, you can touch
sort of
on
like
all
the
those
Agent Carter
hallmarks
show sort of thing that they did, or with Fury involved in
with
that?
Fury involved, and have an older Peggy running the show. It would be very James Bondish, but deal with that, you know, civil rights era. You know, having an African American spy at the head of the film. You know.
All right, I have a last question for all 4 of you. Realizing that many of the people who are listening to this their only exposure of Marvel might be through the films or maybe through the Netflix series, what I'd like for each of you to do for me, for those who have enjoyed the films, give them one series or give them one, say, bound graphic novel that you think that they ought to read. And I also want you to tell me, what would you want to see next from Marvel? Well, what film would you want to see next?
I think I mentioned it already, and for me, it's The Crew.
Yeah.
I you know, it's for me, when I first saw Minefield as a character, as a black superhero who, you know, is helping Captain America, you know, saving them. I was really exciting, and then when I saw the cover for The Crew for the very first time, and saw all those black heroes all together, was something that I just thought, wow, if this was ever to be a film or a TV series, I would, I would do whatever I could to see that happen. So I would really, 2 issues, it's easy to get. Yeah.
Nice. Paul?
Yeah, I guess I did touch on it a little bit just at the end there with the Nick Fury Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., 60s, 70s book, or even I know it's a rights issue at the moment, but I really love a good Kirby-esque treatment of Fantastic Four.
Nice.
Even if they set it in the 60s and 70s and wormhole them to the future present, I felt like Cap did a little bit of Man Out of Time, but it wasn't. It'd be interesting to see a family dynamic out of time, particularly the Reed Richards Sue Storm dynamic in the future, and Sue realising that women have a bit more of a place than they did in the 60s, and Reed having to really learn to stretch and adjust. Anyway, shut up.
Every pun intended. Every pun intended.
Did you plan
Exactly.
that?
Nicely done.
I know, but if people aren't familiar with Jack Kirby's work, for sure, anywhere between the 40s to the 60s are issues of Fantastic Four or his run on Thor.
Yeah.
You would have seen it in Guardians of the Galaxy 2. That's all Kirby. Ego, the Watchers, it's all there.
Nicely done. Jason?
Yeah, I'd say, look, 60s Fantastic Four, go in and pick up a trade paperback of that. I think, look, for sort of the schmaltz and the flatlining of the whole universe is a good introduction. I think Secret Wars in the 80s was a great entry point. Everyone was there. They're having big fights. There's a bit of character development here and there. That's a great entry point. For me, with Marvel, you walk around an exhibition like this, you can see the different genres in the rooms. I'd like them to push those genres further. It's like you said, not every film has to be 100 million. Let's go for some smaller character pieces. Let's go for a horror film set in the Marvel universe. Let's go for a thriller set in the Marvel. That's it. Yeah. But I think we can really go further with the whole multi-genre thing. They did such a good job with Guardians, bringing in science fiction. Just go wild. Let's see a Western. Let's see all these things in the, which Logan.
That would be
Logan was,
yeah.
Naja.
So I think the one that I would want to have people read, and the one that I really, really want to see on screen, is Ed Brubaker's arc of Bucky Cap.
Yes.
I really want to see a Captain America that has to deal with the fact that he personally is evidence of the nation's checkered past and its moral greys, and the fact that this is a character who within himself has to reconcile sort of standing up for what's right after having done so much wrong. It is just a phenomenal book, and again sort of genre mixing where Brubaker's really much more comfortable writing sort of hard-boiled noir stuff, and it is a hard-boiled noir book. And it deals in so many ways with the idea of challenging those narratives, particularly the narratives of War's wonderful line where Cap talks about when he's thinking maybe Bucky is still alive, he's discovering that the Winter Soldier exists. He says that Bucky was meant to be a sidekick and kind of a counter image to the Hitler Youth, but there was always a darker truth underneath, and that he was a child assassin. And so even as Bucky's sort of reconciling with his memory of always wanting to be Cap while knowing intimately that Cap was the kind of person who employed a child assassin, because that was him. And so, the idea that even he couldn't even isolate his moral greys to the Cold War, where he was turned into an assassin, that they made him that because that's who he was in what America calls the good war of World War II. So I think, on the one hand, just fantastic characters that I really love, and characters that I really enjoy because they have to address that kind of, believing in what's right in spite of what there is.
Fabulous. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me with thanking the panel for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah.
And like we mentioned before, this is being recorded for Big Ideas, and so I imagine they're going to turn this around pretty quickly, so keep your eyes open if you want to revisit anything. I also encourage you to stay around for 2 more talks this afternoon. Firstly, an artist talk at 1:30 p.m. with Wayne Nichols, the artist behind the Spider-Man mural in the exhibition, and at 2:30 p.m., a conversation with Brett Chilman, owner of one of the world's largest private comic book collections. Both of these will take place at the River Room stage inside the exhibition space. Thank you so much to you all.